"Do not be seen," her aunt had said, adjusting a diamond clasp that was worth more than everything Clara Whitmore owned combined. "And whatever you do, do not be noticed." The ballroom of Ashridge Hall shimmered with light, so bright it almost erased the shadows. Chandeliers blazing overhead, silk skirts whispering against polished marble, laughter rising and falling like something carefully rehearsed. And Clara stood at the very edge of it all, not quite inside, not quite outside, holding a silver tray that felt heavier with every passing second. She had not been announced, not properly. Her name misread and dismissed as though it had been an afterthought, and the moment had already moved on without her, as if she had never belonged to it in the first place. Around her, young women in gowns tailored to perfection stood in gentle clusters, their gloves pristine, their smiles measured, each one positioned just right, as though the entire room had been arranged for their benefit. And perhaps it had, because tonight was not simply a gathering, it was a selection, and every glance, every step, every carefully angled turn of the wrist carried meaning. Clara did not move toward them. She remained near the wall, steady, quiet, her fingers curled beneath the tray to keep it level, though a faint tremor had begun at the base of her wrist, not from fear exactly, something quieter than that, something she had learned long ago to keep contained. The music swelled, then softened, then shifted again, and she became aware of the small details instead, the things no one else seemed to notice. A loose thread near the hem of her sleeve, the slight chill, where the draft slipped through the tall windows, the way her shoes, polished but worn at the edges, pressed uncomfortably against the marble floor. It was not the kind of discomfort that demanded attention, only the kind that reminded her, quietly and persistently, exactly where she stood. A pair of ladies passed too close, their skirts brushing the edge of her tray, one of them pausing just long enough to glance at her with polite disinterest before continuing on, as though Clara were part of the room's arrangement, useful, unobtrusive, and entirely unremarkable. She adjusted her grip, just slightly, not enough to draw notice, and lowered her gaze to the glasses arranged in perfect rows, each one catching the light, each one reflecting something brighter than her own reflection. Somewhere across the room, a name was called, followed by soft applause, and she did not look up because she did not need to. She already understood how the evening would unfold, how it always did. Those who mattered would be seen, those who did not would simply remain. And then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a subtle precision that moved through the room like a held breath. The music faltered, just for a fraction of a second, not enough for most to notice. But Clara did, her fingers tightening instinctively around the tray as the air itself seemed to settle into something sharper, more deliberate. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, not with force, but with certainty, and the sound of them, quiet though it was, carried. She did not turn immediately, not because she did not want to, but because she had learned the cost of moving too quickly, of reacting too openly. So she remained still, allowing the shift to reach her fully before she let her gaze lift, just slightly, enough to see the edge of movement reflected in the polished surface of a glass. He had entered. She did not need to see him clearly to know it. The effect was immediate. Conversation softened, posture adjusted, attention redirected, not in unison, but close enough to feel intentional. And when she finally looked, properly this time, it was not at his face first, but at the space around him, the way it seemed to narrow, as though the room itself were making room. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood near the threshold, his presence not announced, not emphasized, and yet undeniable. His posture composed, his expression unreadable, his gaze moving slowly, deliberately, as though he were not searching for anything in particular, and yet already knew exactly where it was not. Clara lowered her eyes again, quickly, not out of fear, not entirely, but out of instinct, because attention, especially his, was not something she could afford, not tonight, not here, and she adjusted the tray once more, the smallest motion, barely visible, just enough to steady the glasses, just enough to steady herself, unaware that somewhere across the distance between them, his gaze had already begun to move in her direction. Clara adjusted the tray again, this time more deliberately, shifting the weight from her left hand to her right as a passing footman brushed too close. his sleeve grazing the edge of the glasses without apology, and she stepped back half a pace, careful, precise, placing herself once more against the boundary where light softened and attention thinned. The music resumed, smoother now, as if nothing had interrupted it, and the room returned to its rhythm. Conversations rebuilding, laughter rising again. But it was not the same, not exactly, because something had changed in the air, something that did not announce itself yet pressed quietly against every movement. She kept her gaze lowered, not entirely to the floor, but just enough to avoid drawing notice, focusing instead on the minute details that gave her something solid to hold on to. The faint condensation forming along the rim of a glass, the subtle tilt of a liquid surface when someone brushed past, the way her own reflection appeared distorted in the curved edges, elongated, unfamiliar. A cluster of young women moved closer to the center of the room, their voices light, their laughter effortless, and one of them glanced briefly in Clara's direction before leaning in to whisper something to the others, a comment soft enough not to carry, but clear enough in its intent, followed by a quick flick of the eyes downward toward the tray, toward Clara's hands, and then away again, as though she had already been understood and dismissed in the same breath. Clara did not react, not outwardly. Her posture remained steady, shoulders aligned, chin level, the kind of stillness that came not from comfort but from practice, because movement, even the smallest kind, could invite attention, and attention, in a room like this, was rarely given without cost. Across the ballroom, Duke Adrian Blackwood had begun to move, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a measured pace that seemed to draw the space around him into order, his steps even, his gaze unhurried, passing from one face to another without lingering. And yet each person he passed adjusted in some subtle way, a straightening of posture, a slight turn of the shoulders, a breath held just a moment longer than necessary. Clara became aware of his movement not by looking directly at him, but by the ripple it created, a shift in how others positioned themselves, how conversations faltered and resumed, and she felt it approach before she allowed herself to acknowledge it, the way one senses a change in temperature before feeling the heat itself. She lowered the tray slightly, adjusting her grip as a gentleman reached for a glass without meeting her eyes, his fingers brushing the rim, lifting it away, leaving a small gap in the otherwise perfect arrangement, and she moved one step to the side to rebalance the remaining glasses, her motion smooth, controlled, almost invisible. The hem of her dress caught briefly against the edge of her shoe, and she paused, just for a fraction of a second, bending slightly at the waist to free it, her fingers quick, efficient, and when she straightened again, the movement aligned with the music, as though it had always been part of the choreography. A pair of older ladies stood nearby, their conversation low but not entirely private, and one of them said, with a tone of casual certainty, "Some people should learn where they belong," followed by a soft, approving murmur from the other, and Clara's hand tightened imperceptibly around the tray, the muscles in her fingers holding just a fraction too firm before she released the tension again, smoothing it away, because reaction would only confirm what they had already decided. She shifted her weight back onto her heels, grounding herself, focusing on the steady rise and fall of her breath, the controlled rhythm that kept everything else in place. And then, without warning, the movement of the room altered once more sharply this time, as Duke Adrian changed direction, not continuing along the expected path toward the center, where the most prominent families had gathered, but angling instead toward the outer edge, toward the quieter space where Clara stood. The distance between them closed gradually, each step measured, each second stretching just enough to be noticed. And though she did not look up immediately, she felt the proximity in a way that was impossible to ignore, the subtle stilling of those nearby, the slight widening of space as others instinctively shifted aside, creating a path that had not been there before. Clara lifted her gaze, slowly, not fully, just enough to see the polished surface of his shoes come into view within the edge of her sight, the dark leather catching the light in a muted sheen, stopping precisely within arm's reach, and for a moment, nothing happened, no words, no gesture, only the quiet alignment of presence, his and hers, intersecting in a way that did not yet make sense. And she held the tray steady between them, her fingers firm, her expression composed, unaware that in that stillness, in that narrow space where attention had settled, something had already begun to shift beyond her control. Clara did not move at first, not when the Duke stopped within reach, not when the subtle current of the room shifted around them, because movement, in that moment, felt like a decision she was not yet ready to make. The tray remained steady in her hands, though she could feel the weight of it more clearly now, the slight strain in her wrists, the delicate balance required to keep each glass aligned, and she focused on that, on the physical certainty of it, rather than the presence standing directly before her. His shoes remained still, precisely placed, the line of his stance clean, deliberate, and for a brief second, it seemed as though time itself had narrowed to the space between them. Everything else dimmed, softened, held at a distance. Then, without warning, a hand reached across her line of sight, quick, careless, belonging to a gentleman who had stepped too close, his movement uncoordinated, his attention elsewhere, and his fingers struck the edge of the tray. The motion was small, almost insignificant, but the effect was immediate, a glass tipping, then another, the liquid shifting, the balance breaking, and Clara reacted on instinct, her left hand tightening, her right adjusting, her body turning slightly to absorb the movement, to correct it before it could become something worse. For a moment, it worked. The glasses steadied, the tray leveled, and she exhaled, barely, her breath controlled, contained. But the gentleman did not step back. He laughed instead, a short, dismissive sound, and reached again, this time less careful, his fingers closing around the stem of a glass while his other hand brushed against Clara's wrist, not intentionally, not entirely, but with enough force to disrupt her hold. The tray tilted, just a fraction, and that fraction was enough. One glass sliding, then another, the delicate alignment collapsing into motion. Time fractured. The first glass slipped from its place, hovering for a fraction of a second at the edge, catching the light, suspended, and Clara saw it as if everything else had. Slowed, her hand moving, faster than thought, reaching to catch it, her fingers stretching, the muscles in her arm tightening as she shifted her weight forward, her heel lifting slightly from the floor, and then, before her hand could close around the glass, another movement entered the space, precise, controlled, cutting through the moment with quiet certainty. Duke Adrian's hand moved, not fast in the way that draws attention, but exact, his fingers closing around the edge of the tray, steadying it, stopping the motion before it could continue, before the remaining glasses could follow. The falling glass did not shatter. It was caught, not by Clara, but by him, his other hand lifting just enough, intercepting its descent, the crystal settling against his palm with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. For a moment, everything held. Clara's hand remained suspended in the air where it had reached. Her fingers still curved as if they still held something. Her breath paused, somewhere between inhale and release, and the room around them seemed to hesitate, as though unsure whether to continue. He did not look at the glass. He did not look at the tray. His gaze moved instead, upward, steady, settling on her face with a focus that felt deliberate, measured, and entirely unshared with anyone else in the room. Clara became aware of her own position in a way she had not been before, the angle of her arm, the closeness of his hand to hers, the fact that he was holding the tray with her, that the weight she had carried alone a moment ago was now divided, balanced between them. She lowered her hand slowly, carefully, as though any sudden movement might break whatever fragile alignment had formed, and her fingers returned to the underside of the tray, adjusting their grip to accommodate the new balance. He released the glass first, setting it back into place with a precision that suggested he had already measured exactly where it belonged. Then, a fraction of a second later, he let go of the tray itself, the weight returning fully to her hands, though it no longer felt quite the same. The gentleman who had caused the disturbance stepped back at last, his expression shifting, not quite embarrassed, not quite indifferent, something uncertain in between, and he adjusted his cuff as though that might correct what had just occurred. A few nearby guests exchanged glances, subtle, restrained, their curiosity contained within the boundaries of propriety, but present nonetheless. Clara lowered her gaze again, instinctively, but not as quickly as before, not with the same urgency to disappear. because something had already changed, something she could not yet name, but could feel in the way the space around her had settled differently. Duke Adrian remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture unchanged, his presence as controlled as it had been when he entered, and then, without comment, without explanation, he stepped back half a pace, creating a distance that was small but unmistakable. The music continued, the room resumed its motion, but the moment lingered, held in the quiet awareness of those who had seen it, and Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom with the tray steady in her hands, aware, for the first time that evening, that she had been seen. The shift did not go unnoticed. It never did in a room like this, where attention was currency, and deviation was risk, and Clara felt it before she saw it, the subtle tightening of space around her, the way conversation thinned just enough to leave room for observation. She adjusted the tray again, this time more carefully, as if precision alone could return everything to its proper place. But the balance had already changed, not in the weight of the glasses, but in the way she now occupied the room. A figure approached from her left, heels measured, posture exact, and Clara did not need to look to recognize her aunt, Lady Beatrice Whitmore, whose presence carried a particular kind of refinement that never softened into warmth. The woman stopped close enough that the edge of her gown brushed Clara's sleeve, and without touching her, she reached up, adjusting the angle of Clara's shoulder with a light, controlled pressure, guiding her half a step back toward the wall, correcting her position as one might adjust a misplaced object. "You have already drawn more attention than necessary," Lady Beatrice said quietly, her voice smooth, unhurried, carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest without becoming a spectacle, "and I would prefer not to explain why." Clara inclined her head, a small motion, acknowledging without responding, because response would suggest equality, and equality was not what this moment allowed. She shifted her weight back, returning to the exact boundary she had occupied before, the place where she could exist without interrupting the carefully constructed order of the evening. But the order did not fully restore. Across from them, two gentlemen paused mid-conversation, their eyes lingering just a fraction too long before they turned away, and a cluster of young women nearby adjusted their stance, their attention divided now between the center of the ballroom and the edge where something unexpected had occurred. Clara kept her gaze lowered, but she could feel it, the difference, the way the room no longer passed over her entirely, the way she had become, in some small but undeniable way, part of its awareness. Lady Beatrice's hand withdrew, the correction complete, and she offered a brief, polite smile to a passing acquaintance, before turning slightly, positioning herself just enough to obscure Clara from direct view, a subtle shield that was less protection than containment. "Remain here," she added, softer now, though no less firm, and Clara did not move, did not speak, because she had learned the value of stillness, of compliance, of becoming exactly what was expected. And yet, the moment did not settle. The music continued, the rhythm steady, but beneath it, something else moved, a tension that had not been present before, a quiet reordering that had not yet resolved. Duke Adrian Blackwood had not returned to the center of the room. He remained within sight, not close, but not distant either, his position deliberate, his attention not fixed, but not entirely elsewhere. Clara became aware of him again through the absence of sound, the way a nearby conversation faltered when he passed, the way a servant stepped aside a fraction too quickly, the way space adjusted around him without instruction. She kept her gaze lowered, but her awareness sharpened, attuned now to the smallest changes, the shift of air, the alignment of movement, the presence that did not announce itself yet altered everything it touched. A footman approached to relieve her of the tray, his steps precise, his expression neutral, and Clara turned slightly to accommodate him, lifting the tray just enough for him to take it, her fingers releasing their hold with care, the weight leaving her hands in a smooth transfer. For a moment, her hands were empty, the absence of weight unfamiliar, almost unsteady, and she clasped them lightly in front of her, fingers interlacing, grounding herself in the simple contact. The footman stepped away, merging back into the flow of service, and Clara remained where she was, no longer holding anything, no longer performing a task, and the lack of purpose felt more exposed than the labor had. Lady Beatrice shifted again, as if to speak, but before the words could form, the music altered, not stopping, but changing, the tempo slowing, the arrangement transitioning into something more formal, more structured, and a murmur moved through the room as pairs began to form, invitations extended, hands offered, the choreography of selection beginning in earnest. Clara did not move toward it. She remained at the edge, as she always had, watching the movement without entering it, her place defined by absence rather than participation, and then, without warning, the space before her cleared, not gradually, not by accident, but with a subtle precision that suggested intention, guests stepping aside, not abruptly, but in sequence, creating a narrow path that led directly from the center of the ballroom to where she stood. Clara's breath caught, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that she felt it, the slight interruption in the rhythm she had maintained all evening, and she lifted her gaze, slowly, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the undeniable sense that something was about to shift. Duke Adrian was moving again, his steps measured, his direction unmistakable, and as he approached, the room seemed to hold itself in suspension, conversation fading, movement slowing, attention converging in a way that could not be ignored. He did not look at anyone else. His gaze remained steady, fixed, and when he stopped before her once more, closer this time, within a distance that left no ambiguity, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged, waiting. Clara's hands remained clasped, her posture aligned, but something in her stance had changed, something subtle but real, a readiness she had not possessed before, and as the music continued around them, distant now, secondary, she became aware that whatever came next would not pass unnoticed, not by the room, not by him, and not by herself. "If you move, you will be seen," her aunt whispered under her breath, but Clara did not move because she already was. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood directly before her now, close enough that the distance between them no longer belonged to the room, but to something far more precise. His presence cutting through the music, through the layered voices, through every carefully arranged expectation that had defined the evening up to this point. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and that silence was not empty. It was deliberate, stretched just enough to draw every eye without a single raised voice, and Clara felt it. The weight of attention settling over her shoulders in a way that was unfamiliar, heavier than the tray had ever been. She kept her hands clasped, fingers interlaced, holding them steady at her waist, her posture aligned, her chin level, but her breath shifted, not visibly, only slightly, enough that she felt it in her chest. He looked at her as though the rest of the ballroom had receded, his gaze not hurried, not intrusive, simply fixed, with a clarity that made avoidance impossible. Then he moved. It was a small motion, barely more than a shift of his hand, but it carried, his gloved fingers extending forward, stopping just short of her own, the invitation unmistakable even before a single word was spoken. The music continued, slower now, measured, and somewhere behind him, a couple stepped into position, then another, the pattern of the dance forming across the floor like something inevitable, something expected. Clara did not raise her hand immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly against each other instead, a reflex she did not quite control, because this was not a moment that belonged to her, not in the way the evening had been structured, not in the way she had been placed within it. "Your Grace." Lady Beatrice's voice entered the space, smooth, composed, but edged with a restraint that suggested calculation rather than ease, and she stepped forward just enough to position herself within the line of sight. Not obstructing, not directly, but close enough to be acknowledged. "My niece is not," she began, and then stopped, because he did not look at her, not even briefly, his attention remaining exactly where it had been, as though the interruption had not occurred at all. The pause that followed was precise, controlled, and in that pause, something shifted again, more sharply this time, the balance of the moment tilting in a way that could not be undone. Clara became aware of the room in fragments. The way conversations had thinned into near silence, the way a fan stilled mid-motion in a lady's hand, the way a gentleman's glass hovered just below his lips, forgotten, suspended between action and stillness. She could feel their attention now, not diffuse, not distant, but focused, converging, and it pressed against her in a way that demanded response. Duke Adrian's hand did not lower. It remained where it was, steady, patient, as though time itself would adjust to his pace rather than the other way around. Clara's gaze dropped to that hand for a fraction of a second, the dark glove, the line of his wrist. The space between them measured in inches that felt far more significant than they should have. Then she lifted her eyes again, meeting his gaze fully this time, and something in her posture changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to name, but enough that she felt it, the subtle alignment of her shoulders, the steadiness in her stance, the decision forming before she allowed herself to question it. She released her hands. The movement was small, controlled, her fingers separating, her right hand lifting, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a measured precision that matched his own. For a moment, the distance between their hands remained, the final fraction of space holding, and then her fingers rested lightly against his. Contact. The world did not stop, not truly, but it felt as though it had. The music dimming, the room narrowing, every other movement reduced to something distant and secondary. His grip was firm, not forceful. His hand closing around hers with a certainty that did not ask permission because it did not need to. He stepped back, guiding her forward, and she moved with him, one step, then another, her shoes gliding across the marble, her body aligning with the motion before she had fully processed the decision that had set it in motion. The space around them opened, not dramatically, but enough, guests shifting aside, creating a path that led them toward the center of the ballroom, the place she had never intended to stand. Lady Beatrice did not follow. She remained where she was, her expression composed, her posture unchanged. But her stillness carried a different weight now, one that suggested calculation had been replaced by something less certain. Clara felt the change in elevation, not physical, but perceptual, the way the room seemed to tilt as she crossed from the edge into the center, the way the light caught differently here, brighter, more direct, leaving fewer places to disappear. Duke Adrian stopped when they reached the open space, turning slightly to position her before him, his hand releasing hers only to settle at the proper distance required by the dance, his other hand lifting just enough to indicate the next movement. He did not speak. He did not need to. The music rose, filling the space between them, and Clara followed, her steps aligning with his, her body responding to the structure of the dance even as her awareness remained fixed on the fact that every eye in the room was now on her, not as background, not as an afterthought, but as something that had, for reasons no one yet understood, been chosen. And as they moved, one step, then another, the rhythm steady, controlled, Clara realized that the boundary she had stood against only moments ago no longer existed, and whatever came next would not allow her to return to it. The first turn came sooner than Clara expected, his hand guiding her with a precision that left no room for hesitation, his palm steady at the proper distance, not touching where it should not, yet close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence through the layers of silk and air between them. She followed, because not following would have been more noticeable than any misstep, her body aligning with the rhythm of the music, her feet moving in measured arcs across the marble, one step, then another, the pattern unfolding beneath her as though it had always been there, waiting for her to enter it. The room did not resume its normal pace, not entirely, because even as other couples began to move, their motion remained secondary, their conversations quieter, their attention drawn, again and again, back to the center where she now stood. Clara kept her gaze level, not fixed on him entirely, not lowered completely, finding the narrow space in between where she could exist without losing herself. But his attention did not waver. It remained steady, controlled, following her movements with a focus that felt deliberate rather than accidental. "You adjust quickly," he said, his voice low, not loud enough to carry beyond the space between them, and she felt the words more than she heard them. The calm in his tone not quite neutral, not quite evaluative, something more precise than either. She did not answer immediately, because the next step required her attention, her foot turning, her weight shifting, her hand maintaining the correct distance, and then she said, "I have had practice remaining where I am placed." The words measured, controlled, not defiant, but not entirely yielding either. His expression did not change, not visibly, but something in the quality of his gaze shifted, as though he had registered the distinction and chosen not to dismiss it. He guided her into the next movement, a turn that brought her closer for a fraction of a second before the distance reasserted itself, and in that brief proximity, the room seemed to narrow again. The sound of the music dimming, the edges of the ballroom blurring into something less defined. Across the floor, a pair of young women paused in their own steps, their attention faltering, one of them missing a beat entirely before correcting herself, and Clara felt the ripple of it. The way her presence here disrupted not just expectation, but rhythm itself. She steadied her breathing, focusing on the pattern, the count, the alignment of her steps with his, because that was something she could control, something that did not depend on anyone else's perception. And yet, control was not entirely hers. His hand shifted, just slightly, adjusting the angle of her movement, guiding her into a turn that carried her half a step closer to him than before, and for a moment, their alignment was exact, their movements synchronized in a way that felt less like instruction and more like inevitability. Then, as quickly as it had formed, the moment expanded again, the distance returning, the structure reasserting itself. "You were not meant to be here." A voice cut in, not loud, but sharp enough to reach them, and Clara recognized it before she turned. Lady Beatrice had moved closer to the edge of the dance, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, but her presence unmistakably directed. Clara did not break the pattern. She could not without drawing more attention, so she continued the movement, her gaze flicking only briefly toward her aunt before returning to the space between her and the Duke. "And yet she is," he replied, not raising his voice, not turning toward Lady Beatrice, his focus remaining exactly where it had been, his tone calm in a way that carried more weight than volume ever could. The words settled into the space, precise, unembellished, and the effect was immediate, not in noise, but in silence, the kind that follows a statement that cannot be easily corrected. Clara felt it again, the shift, sharper now, more defined, the balance of the moment tilting further away from what had been expected. Her next step faltered, just slightly, not enough to break the dance, but enough that she felt it, the brief loss of alignment, and his hand adjusted in response, steadying, guiding her back into the pattern without drawing attention to the correction. "Do not look at them," he said quietly, the words positioned between movements, between steps, where they would not interrupt the rhythm, and she understood, not as instruction, but as something closer to assurance. She lifted her gaze, not to the crowd, but to him, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since the dance had begun, and the connection held, not prolonged, not dramatic, but clear, undeniable. The music swelled again, the tempo shifting slightly, signaling the next sequence, and he led her through it with the same controlled precision, his movements consistent, unhurried, as though the attention of the room had no bearing on what he chose to do. But the room did not release them. Whispers had begun now, quiet, contained, but present, moving along the edges of the ballroom, carried from one pair to another, glances exchanged, conclusions drawn without confirmation. Clara felt the pressure of it, not as sound, but as presence. The awareness that every step she took was being measured, interpreted, assigned meaning beyond her control. And still, she moved, because stopping was not an option, not here, not now. The sequence approached its midpoint, the point where partners would separate briefly before returning. And as he guided her into that moment, releasing her hand for a fraction of a second, the distance between them expanded, the connection broken just enough to be felt. She turned, her movement precise, her posture maintained, and for that single second, she stood alone in the center of the ballroom, every eye on her, the weight of attention pressing in from all sides. Then he stepped forward again, closing the distance, his hand finding hers once more, re-establishing the connection with a certainty that did not hesitate, and the room, which had seemed ready to claim her, shifted again, as though reminded that she was no longer entirely within its control. The music did not slow, but something inside the room did, a hesitation that moved through the air like a held breath, and Clara felt it the moment his hand closed around hers again, firm, certain, leaving no space for doubt, as though the separation had only been a test, and this return was the answer. Her fingers tightened instinctively, not pulling away, not resisting, but anchoring. And he drew her back into motion before the room could reclaim her, his step precise, his timing exact, guiding her into a turn that carried her across the light, deeper into the center where there was nowhere left to fade. The chandelier above caught in her peripheral vision, fragments of gold and glass suspended overhead, and for a second the entire world narrowed into that reflection, her movement beneath it, his hand steady at the correct distance, the sound of silk shifting, shoes gliding, the quiet friction of marble beneath measured steps. Then the awareness returned, sharper than before. Because the whispers had grown, no longer contained at the edges, now threading through the room in quiet currents, carried from one pair to another, glances no longer subtle, no longer easily dismissed. Clara felt them land on her, one after another, like weight added without permission, her name not spoken aloud but implied in every pause, every slight turn of the head, every adjustment of posture from those who believed they understood what was happening and those who did not. She kept her gaze steady, not on them, never on them, but forward, aligned with the space he directed her toward, because to look would be to acknowledge, and acknowledgement would give shape to something she did not yet have the strength to hold. "They will speak," she said, the words quiet, positioned between steps, carried only as far as he allowed them to go, and he did not respond immediately, not with words, but with movement, his hand shifting just enough to alter her path, guiding her into a sharper turn, closer, then away again, the pattern tightening, the space between them narrowing for a fraction of a second before expanding again. "They already are," he answered at last, his tone even, unbothered, as though the fact held no consequence worth noting, and the calm in his voice settled against the rising tension like something immovable, something that did not bend. Clara felt the contrast, the difference between the pressure building around her and the steadiness within his control, and it unsettled her in a way she could not quite name, because she had expected resistance, dismissal, correction, not this quiet refusal to engage with the rules that defined everyone else in the room. The next sequence began, partners crossing paths, the formation widening, and for a moment, his hand released hers again, the separation brief but immediate, and Clara moved through it, her steps precise, her posture unbroken, even as the absence of his hold left her exposed in a way that was impossible to ignore. A gentleman passed close, too close, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, his gaze lingering longer than propriety allowed, and for a second, time slowed, her movement intersecting with his, the line of her path crossing his in a way that should have remained incidental but did not, because the room was watching, because every interaction now carried weight. She adjusted, a subtle shift of her step, her shoulder angling just enough to avoid contact, her balance correcting without hesitation, and the moment passed, but not without leaving something behind, a trace of tension that lingered in the air. Then, before the space could close around her, again, he was there, his hand finding hers once more, re-establishing the connection with the same unyielding certainty, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not visible in any dramatic sense, but unmistakable in the way the surrounding movement adjusted, the way the gentleman who had nearly crossed her path stepped back half a pace, as though reminded of a boundary he had not fully recognized before. Clara felt the shift more clearly now, not just in the room, but in herself, the way her steps no longer carried the same hesitation, the way her posture aligned not out of caution alone, but out of something closer to decision. The music rose again, the tempo tightening, and he guided her into a sequence that required closer alignment, their movements intersecting in a way that left less space between them, not inappropriate, not improper, but precise enough that the distance was measured in inches rather than feet. Her breath caught, just slightly, not from fear, not entirely, but from the awareness of proximity, of control, of the way his presence defined the shape of every step she took. "Why?" she asked, the word quiet, almost lost within the rhythm, but it carried, because it was not addressed to the room, not to the whispers, but to him. He did not answer immediately, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might not answer at all, his focus remaining on the movement, the timing, the exact placement of each step, and then, as the sequence turned again, bringing them into alignment once more, his gaze met hers fully, not briefly, not in passing, but with a clarity that did not soften. "Because you did not move," he said. The words simple, unembellished, and the meaning settled into her in a way that was not immediate, not entirely understood, but undeniable. The next turn came, sharper, faster, and he guided her through it without hesitation, his hand steady, his control absolute, and Clara followed, because there was no other option that would not unravel everything that had already begun. The room did not release them. The whispers did not fade. The attention did not disperse. It intensified, building with each step, each movement, each moment that confirmed what no one had expected to see. And as the sequence approached its peak, the pattern tightening, the rhythm accelerating, Clara realized that whatever had begun here would not end with the music, because the moment had already extended beyond it, beyond the dance, beyond the rules that had defined the evening, and there was no longer a place for her to return to where she had been before. The music did not break, but it tightened, drawing every movement into sharper focus, and Clara felt it in the way her next step landed a fraction heavier against the marble. The rhythm no longer something she followed instinctively, but something she now had to hold onto deliberately, because the pressure had shifted from around her to directly through her. Duke Adrian's hand remained steady, unyielding in its control, guiding her forward into a sequence that demanded precision, their alignment closer now, their movement more contained, and for a moment the space between them narrowed to something that felt almost fixed, as though the dance itself had decided there was no room left for uncertainty. The whispers had changed in tone, no longer curious, no longer speculative, but edged with something sharper, something closer to judgment, and Clara did not need to hear the words to understand them. She could feel them in the way eyes lingered too long, in the way a pair across the floor misstepped entirely before correcting, in the way Lady Beatrice had not moved from her position, her stillness now carrying a tension that no longer resembled control. "You will make this worse," Clara said, her voice low, measured, positioned carefully between movements so it would not disrupt the pattern, and for the first time since the dance had begun, there was something beneath her composure that edged toward urgency. He did not slow, did not alter the rhythm, his hand guiding her into a turn that brought her briefly to his side before returning her to position, the motion fluid, continuous, as though her words had not required immediate response. "It was already worse," he replied, his tone unchanged, and the certainty in it did not rise, did not push, it simply existed. Immovable, as though the room itself could not contradict it. Clara felt the words settle into her, not as comfort, not entirely, but as something that refused to yield to the weight pressing in from all sides, and it unsettled her more than resistance would have. The sequence shifted again, the formation widening, partners crossing paths, and he released her hand once more, the separation sharper this time, more exposed, and she moved through it, her steps precise, her posture aligned, but the distance left her vulnerable in a way that was now unmistakable. A gentleman stepped into her path, not fully obstructing, but close enough to disrupt the clean line of her movement, his gaze fixed on her in a way that was no longer accidental, and for a second, the moment stretched, her next step hanging in the air, the decision of where to place it carrying more weight than it should have. She adjusted, her foot angling, her body shifting to maintain the pattern, but the interruption lingered, the space no longer as controlled as it had been. And then, as if cutting through the moment with quiet precision, Duke Adrian moved, not rushing, not forcing, but repositioning with exact timing, his presence re-entering her space before the imbalance could settle, his hand reclaiming hers with a certainty that did not ask, did not hesitate, and the gentleman stepped back without being told, the path restoring itself in a way that felt less like correction and more like command. Clara felt it. Then, not just the shift in the room, but the shift within the space he occupied, the way his presence redefined the boundaries around her, not by declaration, but by action, by the simple, undeniable fact that where he stood, the rules bent. The music rose, reaching toward its peak, and he guided her into a sequence that demanded full alignment, their movements synchronized with a precision that left no room for error, her steps matching his exactly, her body responding to the structure he set. Without conscious thought, for a moment, everything else fell away, the whispers, the glances, the tension reduced to something distant, because the movement required all of her focus, all of her control. And then, as the sequence turned, bringing them into closer alignment once more, his hand shifted, not enough to break propriety, but enough to anchor her movement in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, and the contact, though measured, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Clara's breath caught, just slightly, and for a fraction of a second, time slowed again, the room narrowing, the light catching in fragments, her awareness sharpening to the point where she could feel the exact placement of his fingers, the steady pressure that guided without forcing. She looked at him, fully this time, not avoiding, not deflecting, and the connection held, not softened, not uncertain, but clear, direct, and entirely unshared with anyone else in the room. "You do not belong to their expectation," he said, the words quiet, positioned between movements, and they landed with a precision that felt almost physical, as though they had weight, as though they altered something fundamental in the space between them. Clara did not answer, not because she could not, but because the meaning of it had not yet settled, had not yet found its place within everything else that was happening. The final sequence began, the pattern tightening, the tempo accelerating, and he guided her through it with the same unbroken control, each step exact, each turn aligned, the movement building towards something that felt inevitable, something that could not be avoided. The room had gone nearly silent now, not completely, but enough that the music stood alone, carrying the moment forward, and Clara felt it, the culmination, the pressure reaching its highest point, the awareness that whatever came next would not simply pass, would not dissolve into the evening as though it had never occurred. The final turn approached, the moment where the dance would resolve, where distance would be restored, where the structure would reassert itself. And as he guided her into that last movement, his hand tightened, not forceful, but deliberate, holding her in place for a fraction longer than the pattern required, extending the moment just beyond what was expected. Freeze. The music held, the room held, and Clara stood there, at the center of it all, his hand still in hers, the distance not yet returned, the boundary not yet restored, and in that suspended second, it became clear that whatever came next would not follow the rules that had governed everything before. The music did not resolve. It hovered, stretched beyond its natural ending, as though even the orchestra sensed the moment had not yet decided what it was going to become, and Clara remained exactly where he held her, her hand still in his, the distance between them suspended in a way that no longer belonged to the choreography. No one moved. Not fully, not yet, because the room was waiting. And the waiting itself had become something tangible, pressing in from every direction. She could feel it. In the stillness of the air, in the way a lady's fan remained half open and forgotten, in the way a gentleman's hand hovered inches from his coat button without completing the motion. Duke Adrian did not release her. Not immediately. His grip remained firm, measured, not possessive, not forceful, but deliberate, as though the moment required his decision before it could continue. Clara's breath slowed, not by choice, but because there was no space left for anything else, her awareness narrowing. To the exact point of contact where his fingers closed around hers, to the steady presence that refused to shift even as everything around them strained toward resolution. And then, the room broke. "This is entirely inappropriate." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the silence, not loud, but sharp enough to carry, controlled yet edged with something that no longer resembled composure, and she stepped forward, no longer remaining at the periphery, her movement precise, her posture unchanged, but her intent unmistakable. Clara felt it before she saw it. The approach, the disruption of the delicate balance that had held for those suspended seconds, and her hand tightened slightly within his, not pulling away, but bracing. Duke Adrian did not turn immediately. He did not release her. He did not acknowledge the interruption with any visible reaction, and that absence of response carried more weight than any immediate correction could have. Lady Beatrice stopped within a distance that demanded recognition, her gaze fixed, her expression composed in the way one maintains control when it has already begun to slip. "My niece has no standing in this matter," she continued, each word placed carefully, deliberately, as though clarity alone could restore order. "And I believe you have made your point." The room listened, not openly, not obviously, but entirely, the attention that had once been divided now converging fully, because this was no longer speculation, no longer curiosity. It was confrontation. Clara felt the shift again, sharper than before, the weight of expectation pressing in, not just from the crowd, but from the woman who had defined her place for as long as she could remember. Her instinct was immediate, familiar, to step back, to release his hand, to restore the distance that would return everything to its proper alignment. Her fingers loosened, just slightly. Freeze. The motion paused at the smallest point, the decision suspended between staying and retreating. And then his grip adjusted, not tightening, not forcing, but correcting, his fingers shifting just enough to hold her in place, to prevent the withdrawal before it could complete. And the message was unmistakable, not spoken, not declared, but clear in the action itself. He turned then, finally, his gaze moving to Lady Beatrice with the same controlled precision he had given everything else, his expression unchanged, his posture unaltered, as though the confrontation did not require him to become anything different from what he already was. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice low, even, carrying without effort, and the simplicity of it cut through the room more effectively than volume ever could. Lady Beatrice's expression held, but something beneath it shifted, something that recognized the refusal, the quiet dismissal of the authority she had assumed. "She is here under my supervision," she replied, her tone measured, but tighter now, less fluid. "And I will not have her. She is here." He interrupted, not raising his voice, not stepping forward. But the interruption itself was precise, absolute, leaving no space for completion. "Because I have chosen to notice her." The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not invite interpretation, and the effect was immediate, not in sound, but in silence, the kind that follows something that cannot be undone. Clara felt it move through the space, the shift that no longer suggested possibility but declared it, the redefinition of her presence not as accident, not as error, but as decision. Her breath caught, not sharply, but enough, that she felt the change, the way her body responded before her thoughts could align with it. Lady Beatrice did not speak immediately. For a fraction of a second, her composure held without words, and in that fraction, the room seemed to tilt, the balance of power shifting in a way that no longer favored the structure it had been built upon. Clara's hand remained in his, no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. Her fingers no longer poised to withdraw, but resting, grounded, as though the decision had been made not just by him, but by the moment itself. The music, which had lingered uncertainly, began again, not fully, not confidently, but enough to signal movement, enough to suggest that the evening would continue, because it had to, because it could not remain suspended forever. But nothing returned to what it had been. The space around them did not close, the attention did not disperse, the whispers did not fade. Clara stood at the center of the ballroom, her position no longer defined by absence, no longer contained by the edge, and as Duke Adrian turned back to her, his hand still holding hers with that same unyielding certainty, it became clear that the moment had already passed the point of return, and whatever followed would not be something the room could easily forget. The music resumed, but it no longer belonged to the room. It belonged to him, because every movement that followed bent itself around the decision he had already made, and Clara felt it in the way her hand remained in his, not as something borrowed, not as something temporary, but as something held with intention. The whispers had changed again, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but sharp, layered with recognition, with calculation, with the sudden need to understand what had just shifted beyond their control. Duke Adrian did not release her as the next sequence should have required, did not step back to restore the expected distance, and that refusal alone drew a new kind of attention, one that carried weight far beyond curiosity. Clara became aware of it in fragments. The subtle repositioning of bodies, the way a group near the far wall fell entirely silent, the way a servant paused mid-step as though unsure whether to continue, and beneath it all, the steady pressure of eyes that no longer saw her as background. "You will cause a scandal," Lady Beatrice said, her voice tighter now, less controlled than before, and she stepped closer, no longer maintaining the careful distance she had held, her presence cutting into the space that had formed around Clara and the Duke. Clara felt the shift immediately. The intrusion, the attempt to reclaim what had already begun to slip, an instinct moved through her, the familiar pull to step back, to yield, to return to the position that had always been hers. Her fingers loosened again, just slightly. Freeze. The motion suspended at the smallest point, the decision balanced between habit and something new. Duke Adrian's hand adjusted once more, not forceful, but final, his fingers closing just enough to prevent the withdrawal. And this time, the message carried more weight, more certainty, because it was no longer simply a correction. It was a declaration. He stepped forward, not a large movement, not enough to break propriety, but enough to shift the alignment of the three of them, placing himself fully between Clara and Lady Beatrice, not blocking, not shielding in any obvious sense, but redefining the space in a way that made the boundary unmistakable. "It will not be your concern," he said, his voice low, even, and the calm within it did not soften the impact. It sharpened it, because there was no effort in it, no strain, only certainty. Lady Beatrice's composure faltered, not outwardly, not in any dramatic display, but in the smallest shift of her expression, the tightening at the edge of her mouth, the brief pause before she spoke again. "You do not understand who she is," she said, each word placed with care, as though clarity could still restore order. "She has no position, no standing, no one thought to ask." He interrupted, and this time, his gaze did not leave Clara as he spoke, not even for a second. The words directed not at Lady Beatrice, but through her, past her, as though she were no longer the point of the conversation. The room stilled again, not completely, but enough, that the shift could be felt, because this was no longer about propriety, no longer about expectation. It was about something deeper, something that did not fit within the structure they all understood. Clara felt it then, the change not just in the room, but within the moment itself, the way it began to turn, to reveal something that had not been visible before. Duke Adrian's hand released hers, but only to reposition, his fingers sliding from her hand to her wrist, light, controlled, guiding, rather than holding. And he turned her slightly, not away from the room, but toward it, toward the full weight of attention that had gathered. The movement was deliberate, precise, and for a fraction of a second, time slowed again, the shift unfolding in clear, sharp detail, the angle of her body changing, the line of her posture adjusting, the way the light caught her differently when she was no longer turned inward but outward, visible, undeniable. "Clara Whitmore," he said, her name spoken, clearly, fully, without hesitation, and the sound of it carried, not loud, but exact, cutting through the layered whispers with a precision that silenced them. No one moved. No one spoke. The name settled into the room as though it had always belonged there, though no one had treated it that way before. Clara felt it land, not as recognition she had earned, not as something she had claimed, but as something given, something placed in the open where it could no longer be ignored. Lady Beatrice's breath caught, just slightly, the smallest disruption in her composure, and Clara saw it, saw the fracture in the control that had defined her presence for so long. "She is my niece," Lady Beatrice said, the words now carrying a different weight, less certain, less absolute, as though the definition itself had begun to shift. Duke Adrian's hand remained at Clara's wrist, not restraining, not possessive, but steady, grounding, and his gaze did not waver. "She is the one who did not step back," he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any elaboration could have, because it was not explanation, not justification. It was selection. The room reacted, not in sound, but in stillness, the kind that follows something that cannot be undone, that cannot be reinterpreted into something safer, something more acceptable. Clara felt the weight of it settle over her, not crushing, not overwhelming, but undeniable. The shift in how she existed within this space, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, but placed at the center of something that had not been meant for her. Duke Adrian stepped closer again, the distance between them narrowing, his hand releasing her wrist only to extend once more, not as an invitation this time, but as a continuation, a motion that assumed acceptance rather than asking for it. Clara looked at his hand, at the space between them, at the room that had gone impossibly still, and for a moment, everything held, the decision suspended, the air itself waiting. Then she moved, her hand lifted, steady, deliberate, and placed itself into his once more, not as something tentative, not as something uncertain, but as something chosen, and the moment, which had stretched to its limit, finally shifted, not back, not toward what had been, but forward into something that could not be undone. Her hand settled into his, and this time, it did not feel like a reaction, it felt like a decision, and the difference was immediate, not in how tightly he held her, not in how the room reacted, but in the way she stood, the way her shoulders aligned, the way her breath no longer adjusted itself to disappear but to remain. The silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, layered with the weight of what had just been said and what could no longer be undone, and Clara felt it settle around her like something tangible, something that did not press her down but held her in place. Duke Adrian did not move right away, not even after her hand met his, as though he understood that the moment required space to exist before it could continue. His gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and for a brief second, the entire ballroom seemed to hold with him, suspended at the edge of something that had already shifted beyond control. Lady Beatrice stepped forward again, not as quickly this time, not with the same certainty, her composure still intact, but no longer absolute, and she stopped just short of them, her eyes moving from Clara's hand and his to Clara's face, searching, measuring, as though trying to locate the point at which this had become irreversible. "You will regret this," she said, not sharply, not with anger, but with a quiet firmness that carried the weight of everything Clara had been taught to fear, and for a fraction of a second, the words landed, not as command, but as memory. Clara felt it, the echo of years spent learning where to stand, how to remain unnoticed, how to exist within the narrow space allowed to her. An instinct moved again, subtle, ingrained, her fingers tightening, not pulling away, but holding on to something she had never been permitted to keep. Duke Adrian shifted then, a single step, not forward, not back, but to the side, altering the alignment of the three of them in a way that placed Clara no longer behind him, no longer partially obscured, but beside him, fully visible, fully present, and the movement was small, almost imperceptible, but its meaning was not. The room reacted, not with sound, but with stillness, the kind that follows a decision that redefines everything it touches. "She will not," he said, his voice even, controlled, and there was no emphasis in it, no attempt to convince, only a statement that did not require agreement. Lady Beatrice's gaze sharpened, her posture straightening in a way that suggested she was recalculating, adjusting to a position she had not anticipated, and for a moment, she said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would restore what had already shifted. Clara became aware of the room again in fragments, the subtle repositioning of those nearest, the way a pair of ladies had turned fully toward them now, no longer pretending disinterest, the way a gentleman lowered his glass slowly, deliberately, as though unwilling to miss a single detail. She felt the attention, not as something distant, but as something that now acknowledged her presence as central, as significant, and it did not crush her as she might have expected. It steadied her, because for the first time, the attention was not something she had been dragged into. It was something she had stepped into. Duke Adrian's hand shifted slightly in hers, not tightening, not restraining, but adjusting, aligning their grip as though preparing for movement. And when he stepped forward again, guiding her with him, it was not toward the edge, not toward retreat, but through the space that had opened, through the line of sight that had formed, and the room parted, not dramatically, not with overt acknowledgement, but with a subtle precision that suggested recognition, rather than resistance. Clara moved with him, her steps steady, her posture aligned, and though the weight of every gaze followed, It no longer felt like something she needed to escape. It felt like something she was now capable of holding. Lady Beatrice did not follow immediately, but her presence remained, her gaze fixed, her silence no longer controlled but contained, and Clara knew, without needing to look, that whatever had just occurred would not end here, would not resolve itself into something simple or easily accepted. The music shifted again, softer now, less structured, as though the orchestra itself had adjusted to the altered rhythm of the room, and Duke Adrian slowed, turning slightly to face her once more, their movement coming to a pause that was not dictated by the dance, but by something else entirely. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the quiet between them was different now, not charged with uncertainty, but with something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. "You may step away," he said, his voice low, not commanding, not insistent, but offering, and the words settled between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Clara looked at him, fully, not searching, not questioning, but measuring, and for a fraction of a second, time slowed again. The decision suspended in that narrow space where choice existed. She did not step back. Her hand remained in his, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and the refusal was quiet, but absolute. His expression did not shift, not visibly, but something in the stillness of him acknowledged it, accepted it without comment, and for the first time since the evening had begun. The balance between them did not feel entirely one-sided. The room held its breath once more, not because it expected correction, but because it no longer knew what would come next, and Clara stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, her place within the moment defined not by where she had been, but by what she had chosen to remain. The room did not return to what it had been. It settled into something quieter, heavier, as though every surface still held the imprint of what had just occurred, and Clara felt it in the way no one resumed their conversations fully, in the way movement remained measured, careful, as though the space itself had shifted and no one yet understood how to move within it again. Duke Adrian did not release her hand, not immediately. And this time the continuation did not feel like defiance. It felt like confirmation, a steady, visible line drawn through the evening that could not be mistaken for accident. He guided her forward once more, not toward the center now, but along the open path that had formed, and the room parted again, not reluctantly, not in resistance, but in quiet acknowledgement, the kind that followed something already decided. Clara moved with him, her steps even, her posture aligned, and the weight of every gaze no longer pressed in the same way. It settled instead, as though the attention had found its place and no longer needed to force itself upon her. The chandeliers above cast a softer light now, or perhaps it only felt that way. The reflections less harsh, the edges less sharp, and she became aware of her own breathing again, steady, controlled, no longer dictated by the need to disappear, but by the decision to remain. They slowed near the edge of the ballroom, though not the same edge she had stood against before, not the place of absence, but a position that allowed space without removing presence. And he turned slightly, releasing her hand at last, not abruptly, not as a withdrawal, but as a transition, his fingers sliding away with a precision that left no sense of loss, only a shift. Clara felt the absence of contact immediately, not as emptiness, but as awareness, the memory of his hold, lingering in the space where it had been, and she did not step back, did not retreat, her stance remaining where it was, grounded, deliberate. The room watched still, though less openly now. The initial shock softened into something more complex, curiosity layered with calculation, respect mixed with uncertainty, and Clara understood, not fully, but enough, that what had happened could not be undone, that the version of her that had entered this ballroom no longer existed in the same way. Lady Beatrice approached again, slower this time, her steps measured, her expression restored to something closer to composure, though the tension remained beneath it, visible only in the smallest details, the angle of her shoulders, the slight pause before each movement. She stopped a few feet away, not closing the distance entirely, and for a moment, she said nothing, her gaze moving over Clara as though reassessing, recalculating, searching for the familiar lines that had defined her before. Clara met her gaze, not with defiance, not with challenge, but with steadiness, and the difference, though subtle, was undeniable. "You have made your position clear," Lady Beatrice said at last, her voice controlled, quieter now, as though the room no longer needed to hear her for the words to carry weight. "And so has His Grace." Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without yielding, the motion small but precise. And she did not look away. Duke Adrian remained where he was, not intervening, not directing, his presence steady but unobtrusive now, as though the moment had shifted into something that no longer required his immediate action. "Then we understand one another," Clara said, the words measured, her voice even, and she felt them as she spoke, the unfamiliar certainty of them, the way they did not tremble, did not soften to fit expectation. Lady Beatrice held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, slowly, she nodded, not in agreement, not entirely, but in recognition, and the gesture carried more weight than any argument could have. She stepped back, creating space where there had once been control, and in that space, something settled, not resolution, not fully, but anew. Alignment that neither of them could ignore. The music continued, softer now, filling the background rather than defining the moment, and the ballroom began to move again, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, as though the room itself had accepted the shift and was learning how to exist within it. Clara remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her awareness sharp but no longer strained. And she felt the difference in the way people passed, the way they looked, not past her, not through her, but at her, with a recognition that had not existed before. Duke Adrian stepped closer once more, not intruding, not commanding, but present, and for a moment, they stood without speaking, the quiet between them no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled into something that did not require explanation. Clara glanced at him, just briefly, and in that glance, she understood that the moment had not ended, it had only shifted, that whatever came next would not be defined by what she had been, but by what she had chosen to become. And as the room continued around them, no longer pressing, no longer closing in, she realized that for the first time, she was not standing where she had been placed, she was standing exactly where she had decided to remain. The ballroom did not forget, it could not, because even as the music softened into something distant and refined, the shape of the evening had already been altered, and Clara felt it in the way the space around her no longer closed in but opened, not out of kindness, not out of acceptance, but out of recognition. Duke Adrian stood beside her, not in front, not shielding, not directing, but present in a way that did not diminish her place within the moment. And for the first time, the balance between them did not feel defined by contrast but by alignment. A servant passed with a tray of fresh glasses, pausing just a fraction of a second as he approached, his posture adjusting, his gaze lowering with a precision that acknowledged her position before moving on, and Clara noticed it, not as something remarkable, but as something new, something that had not existed before. She turned slightly, her movement unhurried, her gaze sweeping across the ballroom, not searching, not avoiding, but seeing, and what she saw was not the same room she had entered, not because it had changed, but because her place within it had. Lady Beatrice remained at a distance now, no longer approaching, no longer correcting, her posture composed but still, as though she had reached the edge of what she could influence and chosen not to step beyond it. And Clara understood, without needing words, that the authority which had once defined her position had shifted into something quieter, something that no longer dictated but observed. Duke Adrian moved then, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty, his hand lifting once more, not extended in demand, not offered as invitation, but positioned in that precise space where choice could exist without pressure. Clara looked at it, just for a moment. The familiar line of his glove, the steadiness of his posture, the absence of insistence, and she felt the decision before she made it, the clarity of it settling into place without resistance. She placed her hand in his again. The contact was immediate, grounded, and this time, it did not carry the weight of the room. It carried something quieter, something steadier, as though the choice had already been acknowledged and no longer needed to prove itself. He turned, guiding her forward, not into the center, not into display, but toward the far side of the ballroom where the tall windows stood, open to the night. And as they moved, the room adjusted once more, not in disruption, but in acceptance, the path forming without hesitation, the attention following without pressing. The air near the windows was cooler, the faint movement of the night slipping through the open space, and Clara felt it against her skin, a contrast to the warmth of the ballroom, a reminder of something beyond the room, beyond the moment. They stopped there, at the edge that was no longer an edge, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them no longer filled with tension but with something that did not need to be defined. Clara's gaze moved outward, past the glass, toward the dark stretch of gardens. Beyond, the faint outline of pathways and hedges barely visible beneath the moonlight, and she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that the boundary she had always known was not where she had been told it was. Duke Adrian's hand remained in hers, steady, unchanged, and then, slowly, he released it, not as an ending, not as a withdrawal, but as a completion, his fingers sliding away with the same precision with which they had first taken hold. Clara felt the absence, but it did not unsettle her. It did not pull her back, because the shift had already taken place, not in his hand, not in the room, but within her. She turned back toward the ballroom, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and the room met her differently now, not as something to be avoided, not as something to endure, but as something that recognized her presence without needing to define it. Duke Adrian remained where he was, not moving away, not stepping forward, his presence still, controlled, and for a moment, their distance existed without diminishing what had already been established. A faint movement drew Clara's attention, a pair of young women near the center of the room lowering their heads in a gesture that was not quite formal, not quite casual, but unmistakably directed, and Clara inclined her head in return, the motion small, natural, unforced. The music continued, the ballroom alive again, but not unchanged, never unchanged, and as Clara stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, she understood that the moment had not ended with the dance, it had extended beyond it, into something that would follow her long after the music had faded. Duke Adrian turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room before returning to her, and though he said nothing, the silence between them carried a final clarity, not a question, not a promise, but an acknowledgement. Clara did not look away. The chandeliers above held their light, the reflection steady, the room moving within its new shape, and for a fraction of a second, everything aligned, the past she had stepped out of, the present she now stood within, and the future that had not yet revealed itself. Freeze, and then the moment passed, not disappearing, not fading, but settling into something that would remain, long after the night itself had ended.